Over the last couple of months, anyone who has been following this channel knows I've been pretty excited because I've been able to get in with a group of 3 other game masters to run All for One Regime Diabolique. And one of those game masters is Ivan from Ivan Mike 1968. If you haven't looked at his channel, you might want to, because he talks about Ubiquity a lot these days as he's been exploring it on his own. He's recently run a zombie survival kind of game, and he's run Desolation, and now he's with us doing this. So from time to time, meaning often, meaning like almost every day, we end up talking about Ubiquity and similar things. And one of the discussions we got into was not long after I ran my session of All for One. I made kind of a comment about what great decisions they had made as players in how they had handled the information that they were given, because it meant that they didn't have to deal with these guys. They ended up not having to have a one-on-one combat with werewolves. Now, when you're first getting into the game and you look at creatures' stats, it doesn't really mean anything. Like, that's how I feel. I look at them and go, I wonder what this thing can actually do. I see it's got large dice pools, but when I build a character, there's areas where I have large dice pools, but I know that I'm only going to get the average. So I might have a 9 or a 10 in something, but that means that it's 4 or 5 successes, which is awesome in a skill check, but not as significant in a combat check. And if you're talking about some kind of monster, it's the combat checks that you're worried about. So what does it really mean? What can this thing actually do? And you can test it out by yourself, but it's not quite the same as having a group of people all coming up with different ideas at the same time. Now, this is the special book produced for Leagues of Gothic Horror, which is full of shapeshifters, and so the werewolves and other shapeshifting creatures in here are very specialized. They're focused on producing a particular flavor. They can all be customized. There's lots and lots of tools and whatnot in here to make the beast the challenge that you want. Like, how were they afflicted with their lycanthropy and whatnot. And this video really isn't about werewolves per se, but the example that caused our discussion was werewolves. And so when you go into All for One, they have werewolves in here. And in fact, one of the early adventures written for the game, no spoilers here, may or may not involve such a creature. But if you go looking in the bestiary in the back for the werewolf, you can find it on page 182 of the print copy, maybe on a different page in the PDF. There is the long description of how you get werewolves in All for One. All for One, while it looks like your typical kind of supernatural setting with werewolves and vampires and witches, oh my, there is an underlying conceit to the game which needs to be understood first. So we have the werewolf, and I won't get into the specifics of how werewolves do what they do in All for One. That's something that's interesting to read. And if you haven't read anything by Paul Wade Williams yet, it's something I heartily recommend doing. He's cool. Anyway, the werewolf, it's listed here as an ally. And what that means is this is telling you that it's point distribution, right? How many points were invested in creating this creature. And this is an easy way for the game master to eyeball its relative level of challenge. Not, well, I suppose they could use it to determine whether or not a group is likely to survive, but the way it strikes me is this threat going to be able to present a scene worthy of inclusion? Meaning, if I put in a creature, is it going to be able to endure a round of combat, kind of thing, if it goes to combat? But my own thoughts rarely take things directly toward combat. I'm not going to pick a werewolf out of the bestiary and drop it into a scene just so we have a combat. But I might have a character who's afflicted with lycanthropy. What happens after that is really up to how play goes. So whenever I put something into play, I'm thinking about it from character perspective, even if it's a rabid animal, you know, outside of a village that the villagers can't figure out how to deal with. I'm characterizing the animal and putting it into a situation and running it through its paces rather than setting it up in a location as an encounter. So this may differ between how I do things and how you might approach things. But the listing starts out with ally 3, and then it gives you its archetype. And that is extremely important in terms of how you will characterize or play the creature or the threat. Right? This is the personality that needs to come across. This is the motivation, the drive, or whatever. So the archetype and the motivation together, they dominate your portrayal of the creature. Then we have a listing of style and its health. So that's up near the top of the stat block, so they're easy to find. Next come the primary attributes and the secondary attributes. And once you've played Ubiquity for a very brief period of time, these are very quick things to check. Now we see that it has primary attributes, its strength and dexterity and things, slightly higher than average on the human scale. So this is a fairly tough opponent, as this spread of traits goes across pretty much the whole set, except for charisma, of course. So it has a charisma of 0, meaning you're not going to have a conversation with the werewolf. You might have the conversation with it in its human form, but once it shifts, all talk is over. So that's something to remember in conjunction with its archetype. The secondary attributes you're going to be using a lot, such as its initiative score and its size and how fast it can move. And that's really important. How fast can it move? How much distance can it cover in its move? Are the characters going to be able to get away? Is it going to be able to run or leap into combat and then get out of the way again? Important stuff. Then we get its most important skills, and it's not provided with too many skills because it fights in a very bestial way. But when we get to its talents, that's when we're informed with what our big guns are, what our major weapons are. So this particular example in the book, it has a bonus to perception. It has quick reflexes, giving it a bonus to initiative. And it has the flurry talent, which means it can attack multiple times. It'll have a penalty. If it gets style, if this creature is important enough to be granted style, then it will be able to attack multiple times, maybe without penalty, or maybe even with a bonus. So this can be a terrifying creature, able to do vast amounts of damage in a single turn. So, what do the stats really tell us about this creature? This tells us, with its alertness rating and its quick reflexes rating, and the fact that it's connected in some way to a wolf, this informs us on how to play it. It's not going to just walk up to you and attack. It's going to harry you. It's going to pursue you. It's going to be aware of where you are in the darkness, and you're not sure where it is. And it's going to use speed to its advantage. It's going to use its ability to move a great distance to its advantage, coming in from very far away and attacking, weathering a response, and then getting out again. It also has certain supernatural abilities because it is a supernatural creature. And here's where we get to have a lot of fun. In our classic understanding of the werewolf, they regenerate. It takes a very specific kind of damage to take a shapeshifter out. Fair enough. The characters, if they don't have that thing, are in trouble. But how do we narrate this? Do they simply take no damage? Does it not matter? Do I just keep saying as the game master, you know, well, you know, you don't seem to have heard it, or just accepting the information about damage and not describing anything? This happens a lot. You can see it happening out there, and you can see even game masters and players who don't want to do that sliding back over the course of several rounds into just, you know, I hit and I do 2 health levels of damage. Someone makes a note and play continues. But that's not really what you want. So these creatures are able to regenerate. They still take damage. So you can get into the narration of swords, or in All for One, musket balls striking the creature and doing harm, and then reveal that these wounds are healing. So, is it possible to take this creature down as a group of fighters without that specific weakness? It might be very close to impossible for any regular group of musketeers to do so. This monster is an incredible threat. And yet, if it simply walks into the group and is doing some kind of clawing and biting routine during combat, the group should very quickly be able to reduce it down to the point where it's incapable of action. A suffering, pitiful beast, right? With its wounds trying to heal, and they just keep stabbing and stabbing and stabbing it, hoping to be able to subdue it, or what have you, or until someone can show up with the proper solution. Not very satisfying, not much of a threat. But played like a wolf, played to the information presented about it, this creature will quickly wipe even the most experienced group, even if they're armed with its bane. So it's kind of interesting, really, how the same creature handled different ways can be no threat at all, not very interesting, and perhaps even boring, or be one of the most memorable encounters ever faced. Now, this is a tough creature. You can achieve the same effect with something that's far, far weaker by treating them with respect. You can present a starting character operating in their own environment and set them up so that when the group of players starts to mess with them, all the advantages are stacked on the side of the threat, not the player group. Now, this is all very basic, I think. Basic game mastery. Treat the creature as what it is, not as a moving collection of wounds to be accrued or delivered by the group. And yet, in play, that's what can happen. And so the trick that I try to employ for myself is to characterize the creature first. Who is it? Even if it's something of only animal intelligence or less, who is it? What is it about? We can think back to the old Star Trek episode, Devil in the Dark, with the Horta, right? The gradual exposure of details about the creature, which then coalesce when the creature is encountered into a characterization of it, so that there can be some kind of emotional response, either pity or terror or hatred of the thing, so that any encounter is provided with hooks that make it relevant, make it important, make it a part of the characters' lives, So there's a reason to talk about it afterward, or a reason not to talk about it afterward, a reason to carry emotional scars from that scene. It doesn't matter if you take an extremely powerful creature to oppose the group of characters, or if you take a relatively insignificant creature and have that be the focus of a scene. If they are played true to their own nature, then you have a chance for a memorable encounter. And you may not be able to make it all the way through that encounter without slipping back into pure game speak. But the more you try it, the more likely you are to have some success. So, what does that mean? Really what we're talking about is description of narration all around the table. So when the game master introduces a creature into a scene and is making the effort to characterize it, to really bring it to life as that creature, as if it were real, then the group tends to respond, right? The creature takes on a lot of significance and people act with more care. So even if it's not really much of a threat from a statistical standpoint, people can be very, very cautious. I mean, consider a scorpion, for example, a very small creature, easily stomped on. But if you were to imagine a scorpion right here, right now, your reaction might not be, it might be like, "Whoa, crap," and trying to get away from the thing. How do we get there? How do we make that happen? Through description and characterization. So the major challenge that I find with carrying that out as a game master and responding to it as a player is that as soon as actual combat happens, then we're dealing with system and description. And description can end up being pushed further and further into the background because we're focusing on getting the mechanics right. And we end up speaking to each other in numbers. And this isn't a criticism. This is an observation. This happens. And it takes a lot of work to push that dialogue in numbers so far into the background that it doesn't really happen. You can encode the numbers that you're exchanging using the system. Like Ubiquity has its scale of successes. You can apply those keywords in your combat. You roll your attack rating and you wind up with 4 successes and you make an offhand comment that it'll be very hard to defend against this. Right? So the game master knows, okay, they scored 4 successes. No one actually has to say that. And the game master might be taking the average for the defense of the creature and therefore not have to take time to roll, not have to distract themselves with that. They just know, they've got it in their head that that creature maybe has a defense of 6 and so will automatically void 3 of those incoming successes. So the player says, it'll be very hard to defend against this blow. And they mime a thrust, and then the game master can just mentally deduct the 3 from the 4 and apply 1 health level to the creature and say nothing about it mechanically, instead diverting their mental resources toward describing the effect of the thrust on the creature. Or, because this was a successful attack, we might borrow something from some other games and have the player describe their successful attack. Now, where's the problem that I've just outlined? Well, if no one's actually exchanging the numbers, then the player doesn't know how successful they were. Now, this can work to your advantage or disadvantage. If they're fighting a completely normal creature or another opponent, and they do 4 successes and they're pretty excited about having those 4 successes on the attack, they might really over-describe the amount of damage because they have no clue. You didn't tell them. So, figuring out collaborative duties, let's say, between all the pieces of this equation can be a realistic challenge. If we don't want to say numbers, right, then I need to figure out a way to say back to you how much was defended, but maybe I don't want to. So there are other ways around that. We can roll in the open, so everyone can see the dice. And if the game master is just intent on taking the average, they can set the ubiquity dice or whatever to display the amount that's being defended against, the amount which must be overcome, which actually just works as a difficulty. You want to attack and do damage? Here's your difficulty. It's 3. Anything over 3 counts as damage successes. It's pretty simple, and it doesn't feel like anybody's cheating or hand waving anything. It just makes things so much faster. So those can just be sitting out. The players roll and everyone can see, everyone can do the math in their head, but they can focus on just describing what's going on. So you can get there if you want to. The question is, do you want to? Does it add anything to your game? Well, that's on you. I quite enjoy using dice and talking about dice, and you can find the numbers to be exciting. So I don't really have a problem if it goes one way or the other way. But I find it usually goes the other way, so I'm kind of a champion for trying the descriptive way to see what kind of effect it has on you. But all these things tie together. You want play to be memorable, and play this week involves some kind of creature which is out there doing terrible things. Why is it doing those terrible things? To whom is it doing those terrible things? Is it always doing them, or is there some kind of cycle of the werewolf? Or is there some reason why the mummy has risen from its grave, and this sort of thing? Characterize it. Really get into who that character is, who that creature is. And then when combat happens, devote the mental resources to making that particular creature memorable in its own right, somehow. And when all those things are working, then the particular creature that's chosen matters less from a mechanical standpoint. It matters in how it can affect the scene, how it can interact with the scene. And like I said earlier in the video, I don't think anything I'm saying here is all that groundbreaking. But when you are playing a new game, I think it's important to remember that you're playing a new game. You're not just making a decision as a game master or making a decision as a player. You're trying to remember how that decision-making process works in this new game and what kind of limitations the setting applies to you. What are werewolves like here? What are mummies like here? What can I expect from sword dueling mechanics or social dueling mechanics? How will these things play out? What kind of speed can I expect for handling this encounter? If I'm having a one-on-one duel with a werewolf, is this a 30-minute proposition I've got ahead of me, or an hour, or is this just 5 minutes to cover the same system requirements? Ubiquity is a very fast system for combat. You can do an awful lot more in a session than you might be used to if you're playing a game like Shadowrun, which breaks things down into very discrete and very descriptive pieces. Right? So Shadowrun, the mechanics take on the burden of setting up what you're going to describe in great detail, piece by piece by piece. This takes time. Ubiquity shows you mechanically what the outcome is, and then you're free to narrate how you got there any way that makes sense, providing everybody around the table has enough information to do so. This can all reside with the game master. It can be shared around the table. That's up to you and the way that you play. So description in terms of bringing in threats can do a lot to disrupt notions of game balance. I've had many experiences where players talked about how tough a particular challenge was, and some of them even became close to being upset by how overpowered the threat was, and how they feared that the whole group was going to be wiped. And I'm quite willing to play into those fears. And often they're wrong. Often the challenge that I've presented to them, mechanically speaking, was never a threat at all. And of course, from my perspective, I put something in a place. If they went there, that's on them. Right? I didn't force that encounter on them. They chose to go there, which is important. But I ultimately chose the thing, so how could I have done such a thing to them? Well, often player perception of the threats I place against them are that these things are hard, that the challenge was difficult, that the force was overwhelming and stuff like this, and this is rarely the case. I find that this technique of building up the description of the creature, of the location, of all of the natural habits or behaviors of this creature is enough to make it, to bring that level of threat that you want without having to burden anybody, including yourself, with having this very complicated, very, very powerful, very, very hard to defeat creature, which is only hard to defeat because of its statistics. It's much more interesting and satisfying, at least for me, to be able to achieve that effect of, oh, I can't believe we survived, using a creature that statistically was never a threat at all. So I hope these kind of scattershot thoughts on using creatures will be somewhat useful as a video response to Ivan and others who are getting into using Ubiquity and want to try and raise the level of description in the game to match the way the game sells itself, and also who are uncomfortable kind of eyeballing the particular challenge a character or a creature might bring, and still wanting to be able to put those creatures into a scene and let them be what they are. Right. So just because a threat seems to be underpowered doesn't mean you can't sell it and make it powerful in terms of how you describe it, and therefore influence the decision making and emotional reactions of the characters and the players behind them. And just because something is incredibly powerful doesn't mean that it has to turn into just kill the players. Have it act in a realistic and reasonable way. It does some damage, it marks them, and then moves off to do something else. Or it consumes the entire party. It's up to you. But more importantly, it's up to the creature in the scene, in the context of the setting.